A misty morning, the cold waters of the Clyde, and thousands of people standing silently on the shore. They didn't come for a parade, not for a celebration. They came to say goodbye. An enormous silhouette slowly fades into the fog. The old man next to you takes off his hat. A woman is crying. And you don't understand. Why? After all, no one died. There was no catastrophe. But something has died. Something huge. Something that will never exist again. It was HMS Vanguard, the largest warship Britain ever built. The last battleship built in the world, by anyone, anywhere, ever. It was launched in 1944, scrapped in 1960. 16 years, and that was it. Its guns could fire. Its engines worked perfectly. Its armor was intact. The Navy simply decided it was no longer needed and sent it to the breakers. For what purpose? Why? And who is behind this? You will find out today. Because behind this story lies something far bigger than the simple scrapping of a ship. Secret reports, political games, a ship built for a war that ended without it, and an era that collapsed along with this steel giant. Watch until the end, and you will never look at naval history the same way again. But first, we need to go back. Back to where it all began. To guns that survived one world war and were resurrected for another. The North Sea, the Battle of Jutland, the largest naval battle in human history. Hundreds of ships, thousands of guns, and a roar that could be heard 200 kilometers away. Among the British ships in that hell were two cruisers, Glorious and Courageous. Huge, fast, armed to the teeth. Each carried 4 guns of 381mm caliber, 15-inch. To understand the scale, a single shell from such a gun weighs almost a ton. One shell. They survived Jutland. They survived the war. And then, they were converted. In the 1920s, the British Navy decided that cruisers had no place in the New World. Glorious and Courageous were turned into aircraft carriers. The turrets with the guns were removed, carefully, gently, and put into storage. Just put in a warehouse, like old furniture. They lay there for 20 years, until the world went mad again. Germany attacks. Britain is at war again. And someone at the Admiralty looks at these dusty turrets and thinks, what if? It is at this moment that the idea of HMS Vanguard is born. Not from a clean slate, but around these guns. Around 4 turrets that remembered Jutland, that saw the first war and were now being called up for the second. But here's what's important to understand. By 1941, when the design was finally approved, these guns were old. Not just old, they were designed before the First World War. Their technology lagged behind German counterparts. Everyone knew this. And they built the ship anyway. Why? Because there was no other choice. British shipyards were overloaded. To build new turrets meant losing years. And war does not wait. Or does it? As it turns out later, it waits indeed. But for now, one man looks at the blueprints of the new ship and utters a phrase that historians would later quote. First Sea Lord Dudley Pound tells his assistant, "It's the best we can do right now. And if the war ends before we finish it?" A pause. A long pause. Then at least we shall have a very beautiful ship. A beautiful ship, built around guns that survived one war, for a war that might end without it. And here's the strangest thing about this whole story. One of the aircraft carriers from which these turrets were taken, Glorious, was sunk by the Germans in 1940. The ship died, but its guns survived, lying in a warehouse, waiting for their hour, as if they knew. So, the guns exist. The design exists. The decision is made. Now, the ship had to be built, in a country that was burning. Clydebank, Scotland, March 1941. 2 days ago, German bombers leveled half the city to the ground. 500 people died. Thousands were left homeless. The smell of burning had not yet cleared from the streets. And yet, morning comes. The whistle blows, and the workers go to the shipyard. They simply go to work. The John Brown and Company shipyard. This is exactly where the Titanic was built, where the Queen Mary was built. And it was here, amidst ruins and ash, that the world's last battleship was to be born. Imagine yourself in these people's place. You just spent the night in a bomb shelter. Your neighbor lost their home, maybe someone close to them, and you go to weld steel, because someone has to, because it's war. Work went on in 2 shifts. The day shift built the ship. The night shift hid from bombs. Sometimes the boundaries between shifts blurred. The air raid siren didn't care about the schedule. One of the workers, a welder named James Mackay, later recalled, "One night a bomb fell 300 meters from the dock. We didn't even stop. We just ducked," and continued. 3 years. That's how long they built Vanguard. 3 years is a long time, even in peacetime. But here, every month brought a new problem. A shortage of steel, it was diverted to other needs. A shortage of hands. Young men were taken into the army. A shortage of funding. Churchill personally demanded a review of priorities several times. Yes, Churchill, the man considered the great defender of the British Navy, actually viewed the Vanguard project with great skepticism. In his diaries, there is an entry from 1942, sparse, harsh. "I doubt the utility, but let them continue." Let them continue. Not, "This is a great project." Not, "Britain must have the best battleship in the world." Simply, let them continue. Meanwhile, the ship grew on the slipway, and the numbers of this ship were truly deafening. Length, almost 250 meters. That's 2.5 football fields laid end to end. Displacement, 52,000 tons fully loaded. Armor on the main caliber turrets, 13 inches. 13 inches of steel. Imagine a brick wall, 3 bricks thick, and multiply the strength by 100. But here is what was happening parallel to the construction, and this is what is rarely talked about. While Vanguard was being built on the Clyde, a revolution was unfolding in the Pacific. December 1941. Japanese planes sink American battleships at Pearl Harbor. Then, the British Prince of Wales and repulse. Not sunk by other battleships, sunk by airplanes. The whole point of a battleship is its invincibility, and suddenly it turns out it is vulnerable, fundamentally vulnerable, from the air. The admirals understood this. The engineers understood this. But they continued to build Vanguard, because the decision was made, the money spent, the workers in place, the machine was running. And here's the main question I want to ask you. If everyone understood everything, why continue? Is this bureaucratic inertia, military stubbornness, or something else? You will get the answer to this question, but not yet. Right now, it is November 30th, 1944. A young woman in a blue coat has arrived at the shipyard. She is 18 years old, and the whole world is looking at her. The clock was ticking, and no one present knew how much time they had left. November 30th, 1944, Clydebank, morning. The crowd gathered before dawn. Shipyard workers, admirals in dress uniforms, journalists with cameras. Everyone was looking at one thing, the massive steel hull standing on the slipway, gray, silent, ready. And then she arrived. Princess Elizabeth, 18 years old, blue coat, white gloves, calm smile. She had been to such ceremonies before. Her father took her along. But today, she is the main figure. The crowd froze. The princess took a bottle of champagne, swung it. The bottle struck the steel side and shattered into pieces. The crowd exploded in applause. The orchestra struck up, and the multi-ton colossus began to slide slowly, almost solemnly, into the waters of the Clyde. HMS Vanguard was born. But let's stop for a second. Because in this crowd, among the smiling people, were a few men who knew perfectly well what exactly they were doing right now. and what it meant. November 1944. Germany is retreating on all fronts. The Allies are already in Paris. The Red Army stands at the borders of the Reich. Any sensible person at that moment understood the war in Europe would end in a few months. And here they launch a battleship, which is at least a year and a half away from combat readiness. Do you see the irony? The ship built for the war was being born at the very moment the war was leaving. One of the admirals at the ceremony wrote in his diary that evening just one phrase: short, harsh, honest. A beautiful ceremony. Pity that it is all a bit of theater. A bit of theater. But was it only theater? Or was there something more behind it? Think about this. Britain in 1944 is a tired country. 5 years of war, bombings, food rationing, death notices. People wanted to believe in victory. Not abstract, but tangible. They wanted to see strength, power. Something that says, we are still a great power. We are still invincible. And here, please, the largest battleship in the country's history, christened by a young princess, a symbol, a living, steel, deafening symbol. Maybe that was the main point of HMS Vanguard. Not a combat unit, a symbol. An answer to the question of an exhausted nation. We are still here. We are still strong. But symbols sometimes cost too much. And now, here's what I want you to remember. That same princess who smashed the bottle of champagne against its hull in 1944, she will be queen in 1960, when this ship is led to the slaughter. Elizabeth will outlive Vanguard. She will sign the documents for its liquidation, being the monarch of the country whose flagship she once christened with her own hands. How about that for a twist? But that is later. For now, the ship is in the water. They are finishing it, arming it, testing systems. Work is in full swing, and somewhere in Berlin, in April 1945, Hitler puts a bullet in his temple. The war in Europe is over. Vanguard is still at the shipyard. In August 1945, the atomic bomb falls on Hiroshima, then on Nagasaki. Japan surrenders. The war is over completely. Vanguard is still at the shipyard. 4 words: still being built. And right here, in this pause between the end of the war and the lowering of the flag on the last Japanese battleship, the main tragedy of this ship is born. Not technical, not military, human. Because people worked at the shipyard. Living people who heard the news on the radio, who understood everything, and continued to work. That is what the next chapter is about. May 8th, 1945, Clydebank, noon. The radio in the factory canteen was blaring at full volume. Workers dropped their tools. Someone stood right there in their work clothes, in oil and soot, listening. The voice of the BBC announcer was solemn and quiet at the same time. Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. On the streets of London, millions of people. Hugs, tears, music. But here, at the shipyard in Clydebank, workers looked at each other. Then, at the hull of the ship, huge, unfinished, silent. One of the riveters, an elderly Scotsman named Robert Finn, wiped his hands with a rag and said to his comrade, "Well then, we're too late." "Too late for what?" "For that." He nodded at the ship. "It has nowhere to go now." 3 months later, August 1945, the atomic bomb, Japan, the end of everything. Now there were no doubts. No, what if it's still useful? The war ended completely, finally, irrevocably. And HMS Vanguard stood at the shipyard and waited. Completion went on as usual. The inertia of a massive machine does not stop because of radio news. Thousands of people continued to work, because contracts were signed, because money was allocated. Because what else was there to do? And here I want you to think for a second about what it's like to build something grandiose, knowing that it is no longer needed. Imagine, you pour your soul into a project for 3 years. You weld steel, attach armor, lay kilometers of cables. You believed it was important, that it was for victory. And suddenly victory arrives, without you, without your ship. And you continue to work, because you have to, because that's how the world works. This isn't just the story of a ship. It's the story of people who found themselves in the wrong time. Officially, HMS Vanguard entered service on August 12, 1946, a year and 3 days after the surrender of Japan. The ceremony was modest by wartime standards. No crowds, no orchestras. Just a raised flag. Just a fleet order. The ship's first commander, Captain William Bellers, assumed command and addressed the crew. His speech is preserved in the archives. It was short, professional, and it contained not a word about the war, because the war was behind them. And what lay ahead? No one really understood. The crew of Vanguard, 2,000 people, young officers dreaming of combat missions, experienced sailors who went through the war on other ships, and those who joined the Navy after victory, for whom Vanguard was just a job, the first in their career. Big, strange, a bit pointless. One of the young officers, Lieutenant Thomas Harris, who joined Vanguard in 1947, left memoirs that historians quote to this day. He wrote, "Serving on Vanguard was an honor. It was the most beautiful ship I have ever seen. But sometimes at night, standing on watch, I looked at those huge turrets and thought, they will never fire for real. They will never do what they were created for. And this thought made me feel uneasy, as if a giant with bound hands is standing next to you. A giant with bound hands. You couldn't say it better. Because technically, Vanguard was magnificent. Its guns could send shells weighing a ton to a distance of 30 kilometers. Its anti-aircraft batteries covered the entire sky around it. Its armor would withstand a direct hit from any gun existing at that time. It reached 30 knots, faster than many cruisers. It was perfect, and perfectly useless. Because the world had changed, not gradually, abruptly. 2 atomic explosions over Japan overturned the entire military doctrine in 8 seconds. The battleship that was built for 4 years became conceptually obsolete in 8 seconds. But let me tell you this, and it is important. It changes the entire perception of the subsequent history. The people who made the decision to continue construction after 1945 were not fools. They understood what was happening. They simply did what they knew how to do, what was within their power. In a world that was changing faster than they could comprehend, there is something very human in that. Do you agree? And now, the next question. Okay, the ship is built. War is over. The fleet doesn't know what to do with it. And then, fate hands Vanguard a completely unexpected role. Not a combat mission. Not exercises. Something far more unexpected. A royal tour. And here, the story takes a turn no one expected. January 1947. Portsmouth. Early morning. The naval base lives its usual life. The cries of seagulls. The smell of diesel and sea salt. Sailors on decks. Flags in the wind. And suddenly, a motorcade. Black limousines with royal standards. Security. Protocol. Ceremony. The royal family boards HMS Vanguard. King George VI. Queen Elizabeth. The mother, not the daughter. Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret. Entourage, servants, suitcases, crates of provisions. The entire court. On board a combat battleship. The destination, South Africa. An official royal visit. The first after the war. The first in many years. And the last in history. Because no British monarch will ever again make a state visit aboard a battleship. But no one knew that yet. Let's stop and understand the context. 1947 is not just post-war. It is a very specific moment in British history. The country won, but at what cost? The national debt is astronomical. Rationing for food is still in effect. Yes, in the victorious country, people still get food with coupons. Industry is destroyed. Cities are in ruins. And against this backdrop, the winter of 1947 turned out to be one of the harshest in a century. Snowfalls, frosts, coal shortages. People were freezing in their homes. And HMS Vanguard was sailing to South Africa. Can you feel the tension? The British press felt it. Several newspapers cautiously wrote about the untimeliness of the journey, but the majority supported it. The country needed a symbol. The country needed hope. The country needed to see its monarchs alive, healthy, confident. Let them sail. And they sailed. Now, about the ship itself during these weeks, because what happened to Vanguard for this journey is a separate story. A combat battleship was prepared to receive the royal family. Imagine the scale of the alterations. Gun magazines were turned into pantries. Officer cabins were converted into royal apartments. Bathtubs were installed specifically for the princesses, on a warship where there are usually only showers. Carpets were laid, curtains hung, royal porcelain and silver were brought in. Outside, armor and guns. Inside, Buckingham Palace. One officer recalled, "It was a strange feeling. In the morning, I checked the readiness of the anti-aircraft crews, and in the evening, I made sure the candelabras were placed correctly in the royal dining room." Candelabras on a battleship. There is your image of the era. But now, about the man who stood at the center of this entire journey. About the king. George VI in 1947 was a sick man. This is not an exaggeration. It is a medical fact. The war years, colossal psychological pressure, natural introversion, combined with the burden of public power, all this destroyed his health. He smoked heavily, like most people of his generation, unaware of the true danger of this habit. His lungs were already showing alarming symptoms. The doctors knew. He himself probably suspected. This trip was an attempt for him to recover. Sea, sun, away from the damp London January, away from endless state papers and audiences. Eyewitnesses said that in the open ocean, when the shores disappeared behind the horizon, the king sometimes just stood on the deck, alone, staring at the water, breathing. Maybe these were the best moments of his life in recent years. And now, the very fact that changes everything. While Vanguard carried the royal family along the African coast, in London, a decision was being made about India, the largest colony of the British Empire, the jewel in the crown. Hundreds of years of presence, and now, that's it. Independence. Britain leaves. Officially, it happened in August 1947, a few months after the ship returned. But the negotiations, decisions, telegrams, all this went on right during the royal voyage. Somewhere in London, officials were dividing maps, deciding the fates of millions. And here, on board the Empire's most powerful warship, the royal family drank tea on the deck and watched the sunset over the Atlantic. The Empire was crumbling, and its symbols were sailing south. There is something almost unbearably beautiful in this, and unbearably sad at the same time. On April 21st, 1947, Princess Elizabeth turned 21. She celebrated her birthday in South Africa, and it was there that she delivered her famous speech, the very one where she promised to dedicate her life to the service of the Commonwealth. Her whole life, whether it be long or short. The speech was broadcast by radio. The whole world listened. And somewhere in the radio room of HMS Vanguard, a young radio operator was recording the signal so the crew could hear it too. The princess, whom this ship carried across the ocean, had just changed history with her word. And the ship simply sailed on. In May 1947, Vanguard returned to Portsmouth. The carpets were removed, the candelabras put away, the porcelain packed into crates. The battleship became a battleship again. The royal tour was over. The king returned home, a little tanned, a little more alive than he was. But not for long. 5 years later, he would be gone. And Vanguard was once again left alone with its main question. A question that hadn't gone anywhere. A question that only became sharper with every passing year. What am I here for? What am I to do in this new world? There was no answer. And it was in this silence that the hardest chapter in the ship's life began. HMS Vanguard would spend the next 10 years in a strange, agonizing existence. Between parades and oblivion. Between pride and shame. Between life and a death that was already foretold. And it was in these years that a term would appear which would stick to it forever. A cruel term. Accurate. Absolutely precise. The white elephant. There is an expression, a white elephant. It comes from Southeast Asia. A white elephant in those parts was considered a sacred animal. It could not be used for work. It could not be sold. It could not be killed. It could only be maintained, fed, groomed. And one would go bankrupt on this maintenance. They say Thai kings gave white elephants to courtiers they wanted to ruin. A gift you cannot refuse. An honor that kills. This is exactly the expression the British press began to apply to HMS Vanguard around 1950. The white elephant of the Royal Navy. And you know what? They were right. Let's look at the numbers, because numbers here speak louder than any words. Maintaining HMS Vanguard cost the British Treasury approximately £1 million a year. By today's standards, that is tens of millions. The crew, 2,000 people who need to be fed, clothed, paid salaries. Technical maintenance of huge mechanisms. Fuel. A ship of this size devoured oil in quantities that gave treasurers headaches. And all this, for what? For parades. For visits. So people could look at it and think, here is the might of Britain. But behind the facade of this might lay an unpleasant truth that everyone at the Admiralty knew but didn't like to say out loud. The truth was that HMS Vanguard was a conceptually obsolete ship in a conceptually changed world. Let me explain what this means in practice. After World War II, naval doctrine turned upside down. Aircraft carriers became the kings of the ocean. The war in the Pacific showed this. Submarines became the main threat. The Battle of the Atlantic showed this. Missile weapons began to displace artillery. And against this background, a huge battleship with its main caliber turrets looked somewhat like a medieval knight in full armor on a 20th century battlefield. Beautiful, impressive, and completely non-functional. The admirals understood this, but what do you do with understanding if the ship already exists? If it stands in the harbor and demands money simply by the fact of its existence? It was used for training exercises, for naval maneuvers, to show the flag in friendly ports. In 1953, it participated in the Coronation Fleet Review. Thousands of ships lined up in honor of the new queen, the same one who christened it 9 years ago. This was, perhaps, its finest hour in the post-war years. The flagship, the lead ship of the parade, the biggest, the most impressive, all eyes on it. And then the parade ended. And again, the harbor, anchor watch, silence. And here I want to tell you about Suez, because this is the key moment, the moment that finally decided Vanguard's fate. Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. Britain is furious. The canal is the artery of the empire. It is trade. It is oil. It is prestige. You can't just take and give it to some nationalist. Britain, France, and Israel begin a military operation. Troops go to Egypt. The fleet moves to the coast. And here is the question I ask you. Where is HMS Vanguard at this time? The country's most powerful warship. A battleship armed with guns capable of demolishing coastal fortifications from 30 kilometers away. A ship for which millions were spent and years of labor laid down. It is sitting in Portsmouth, at anchor. The Admiralty made the decision not to send it. Why? The official version, operational inexpediency. They say, for coastal operations, landing ships and aircraft carriers are needed, not battleships. Technically, correct, but unofficially, it is more complicated. By 1956, Vanguard was fully combat ready. Its guns worked. Its crew was trained. But sending it to Suez meant several very unpleasant things. First, huge risk. If the battleship takes damage or is sunk, it is a catastrophe. Political, military, symbolic. Losing the world's last battleship in a colonial adventure, the Admiralty could not afford that. Second, the cost of the operation. One sortie of Vanguard cost money that post-war Britain had less and less of. Third, the Suez operation was politically dubious from the start. The Americans were categorically against it. The UN was against it. And exposing the flagship to danger unnecessarily in an operation that could be stopped at any moment by political pressure, too risky. And that is how it happened. The operation was halted. Britain retreated. It was a country's last imperial adventure, and it failed. And Vanguard stood in Portsmouth and did nothing. One of the officers serving on the ship at the time later wrote with bitterness, "We listened to the news on the radio. Suez. Our troops are fighting. The fleet is in action. And we are here. I looked at our guns and thought, they will never fire. Never. I understood it right then." After Suez, something broke completely. Not in the ship, in the attitude towards it. The Suez crisis exposed the main contradiction of British post-war politics. The country still thought of itself as an empire, but it acted already as a mid-sized European power. And in this gap between self-perception and reality, HMS Vanguard was the living embodiment of an uncomfortable question. Who are we now? A great maritime power that cannot use its own flagship? An empire that retreats under pressure from Washington? A war victor that cannot afford to maintain a single ship? Questions hung in the air, and the answers to them were becoming more and more obvious. In 1956, a serious internal discussion began at the Admiralty. Not public, quiet, behind closed doors, classified, about the future of the fleet, about what can be afforded and what cannot, about what to do with the white elephant. And it was then that someone took out a clean sheet of paper and began to write a report. The very report I mentioned at the very beginning of our video. The document that decided everything. Do you remember? I promised to show you what was written in it. We are almost there. London, Whitehall, the Admiralty Building. If you've ever been to London, you might have seen this building. Austere, dark, Victorian. Inside, long corridors, oak panels on the walls, portraits of admirals. The smell of old paper and polished wood. The place where decisions were made that changed the world map. It was here, in 1954, that work began on a document classified Top Secret and officially titled Report on the Operational Readiness and Economic Feasibility of Maintaining Ships of the First Line of the Royal Navy. A long title. Behind it hid a simple question. What to do with Vanguard? Work on the report took 3 years. 3 years of commissions, hearings, memoranda, counter-memoranda. Admirals argued with the Treasury. Naval officers argued with civil servants. Everyone understood the decision would be painful. No one wanted to be the one to make it. Because this decision meant the end. Not just the scrapping of one ship. The end of an entire era. The end of the image of Britain that the country had carried within itself for the last 300 years. Mistress of the seas. Let me tell you what options were considered, because it is important to understand that there were alternatives, that this was not an inevitability, that at some point history could have gone differently. Option 1. Keep Vanguard in the active fleet. Continue spending money. Continue maintaining the crew. Continue pretending that the battleship is a relevant weapon. This option was supported by several admirals of the old school, men raised on the idea of sea power, men for whom a battleship was not just a ship, it was a symbol of their own identity. Their argument was simple. As long as we have Vanguard, we are a great power. As soon as we lose it, what are we? An emotional argument, understandable, and financially insolvent. Option 2. Transfer the ship to reserve. Mothball it. Keep it as a potential reserve in case of a major war. Maintain a minimal crew. Pay the minimum, but have a trump card up the sleeve. This option seemed like a compromise, but it had a fundamental flaw. A combat ship that has stood in reserve for several years is not quite a combat ship anymore. Mechanisms degrade. The crew loses qualifications. And when this trump card is needed, it might turn out not to be a trump card, but a fake. Option 3. A museum. Preserve Vanguard as a floating museum of naval history. Dock it in some port. Open it to visitors. This option was discussed seriously. There were people who sincerely advocated for it. The arguments, obvious. Historical monument. Tourist attraction. Living history. But here too, money. Maintaining a floating museum of such scale is also a huge expense. Constant struggle with corrosion, humidity, time. Staff needed, infrastructure needed, and, most importantly, political will is needed to allocate money for years to an object that brings no military benefit. Political will was not found. And finally, option 4. Scrap it for metal, the cheapest option, the fastest, the most painful. That is exactly what they chose. In 1957, the report was finally completed and submitted to the government. Minister of Defense Duncan Sands presented the Defense White Paper to Parliament, a document radically rethinking the entire British military doctrine. The main thesis was simple and cruel. Nuclear deterrence. That is what Britain must bet on. Missiles, carrier aircraft, submarines. Not battleships, not cruisers. Not huge steel monsters devouring the budget. In the document was one phrase that all newspapers later quoted. The phrase I promised you from the very beginning of this video. Verbatim, it sounded like this. HMS Vanguard is of considerable historical value. However, its maintenance under modern strategic realities and financial constraints cannot be justified to the taxpayer. Read that again. Cannot be justified to the taxpayer. Not, the ship is obsolete. Not, the ship is not needed. But, we cannot explain to people why we are spending their money. The country that ruled the seas for 300 years, the country whose fleet sank the Spanish Armada, crushed Napoleon at Trafalgar, defeated the Kaiser and Hitler. This country could not justify the maintenance of a single ship. Do you understand what happened? This is not just a financial decision. This is an admission, public, documented, official admission that the British Empire is in the past. The public reaction was painful. Veteran organizations protested. Newspapers wrote angry editorials. Speeches about betrayal of naval tradition sounded in Parliament. Several admirals resigned, not because it would change anything, but simply out of principle. One retired admiral wrote in his memoirs, "When I was told of the decision, I was not surprised. I knew it was coming. We all knew. But when it happened, it still hurt. Like someone in the family died. Someone whose death had long been expected. But death still comes unexpectedly. Death still comes unexpectedly." In 1959, the decision was officially approved. HMS Vanguard was subject to transfer for scrapping. The date set, 1960. The place set, the shipyard at Faslane, Scotland. The crew began to be gradually transferred to other ships. A 2,000-strong collective of people who knew this ship as their home, dispersed to wherever. Someone got a new assignment. Someone left the Navy. Someone, they say, just stood on the pier for a long time staring at the ship, unable to leave. And the ship stood there, still alive, still combat ready. Mechanisms worked. Guns were ready. Engines could start at any moment. But there was no one to give the order. And here is the quietest, most terrible fact in this whole story. Between 1959 and 1960, HMS Vanguard could have been saved several times. Australia considered buying the ship for its fleet. There were negotiations, serious negotiations. Australian naval officers visited, inspected the ship, wrote reports. Vanguard could have gone to the other end of the world and continued service under a different flag. The negotiations hit a dead end over price and refit logistics. Canada showed interest. Also came to nothing. There was even talk of transferring the ship to NATO, as a training vessel, as a flagship of joint command. This idea died even faster. Every time, almost. Every time. A hair's breadth from salvation. And every time, no. It is like watching a person drown a meter from the shore. Reach out a hand and save them. But no one reached out. The decision came into force. The sentence was final, not subject to appeal. Only one thing remained: the last voyage. And what happened during that voyage, what thousands of people saw on the banks of the Clyde, became one of the most moving scenes in the history of the British Navy. You are almost there. Just a little left. August 4th, 1960. Portsmouth, 5 in the morning. The city was still asleep. Streets empty. Streetlights reflected in the wet cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a seagull cried. But in the harbor, they were not sleeping. Several hundred people gathered on the pier while it was still night. No one called them. No one announced it. They simply knew. The word passed through the city in a few days. HMS Vanguard is leaving. Forever. And people came. Old sailors in worn coats. Women with children in their arms. Veterans with medals on their chests. Just citizens who had seen this ship in the harbor all their lives and perceived it as part of the landscape. As a lighthouse. As something permanent. And now, it is leaving. The tugs began work at dawn. Slowly, very slowly, the huge hull began to move away from the pier. Those standing close said later, you could hear the hawsers creaking, the water splashing against the side, the hum of the tugboat engines. And then, someone on the pier took off his hat. Just took it off, silently, like at a funeral. And following him, another one, and another. In a chain reaction, like a wave, men took off hats and caps. Women pressed handkerchiefs to their lips. Children didn't understand why adults were crying, but they quieted down too. No one commanded this. No one organized it. It was simply human, instinctive, a farewell. Vanguard slowly turned in the harbor. Its huge silhouette against the pink August dawn looked almost unreal. Too big, too alive, too real for what was supposed to happen next. When the ship's prow finally turned north, towards Scotland, towards Faslane, someone on the pier sobbed aloud, not holding back, not ashamed, and no one judged. Vanguard's last route ran along the western coast of Britain, from Portsmouth around Land's End, up the Irish Sea, and into the Firth of Clyde, to where it was built 20 years ago. This journey took several days, and throughout this entire path, people stood on the shores, in small coastal towns, in fishing villages, on the cliffs of Cornwall, on the embankments of Wales. People came out to watch, took photos, waved their hands to the huge ship being dragged to its death. Local newspapers later wrote, in some towns, schools let children out early so they could see it, because there won't be another like this, ever. The world's last battleship was going to the breakers, and Britain came out to say goodbye. On board during this last voyage was only a small technical team, a few dozen people, the necessary minimum to monitor the towing, ensure safety. No full crew, no commands, no military service, just people on an empty ship. One of them, a young mechanic named David Cole, who was 23 at the time, left notes about this trip. He wrote, walking through the corridors was strange, quiet, like in an empty cathedral. Everywhere, traces of people who are no longer there. Someone's photo forgotten on a bulkhead. Someone's mug in the wardroom. Someone left a book, bookmarked in the middle, as if they intended to return. Bookmarked in the middle. When Vanguard entered the waters of the Firth of Clyde, where it was built, where it was launched, where the young princess smashed a bottle of champagne against its side 16 years ago, people gathered on the shores again. shipyard workers, those who built it, some of them already elderly. The same hands that welded its steel, riveted its armor, laid its cables, now clutched hats and watched as their work was led to die. One old welder, he was over 60 then, told a journalist who happened to be nearby, "I worked on it for 3 years, every day. We put everything into it. And now look." The journalist asked, "What do you feel?" The old man was silent. Then he said, "It's like burying your own work, your own years. Your own years." The ship anchored at the Faslane Yard on August 11th, 1960, and it began. The dismantling of HMS Vanguard set a record for speed for ships of this class. Torches cut steel day and night. Huge cranes lifted hull sections. The main caliber turrets, the very ones that remembered Jutland, that survived 2 world wars and never fired in battle for real, were dismantled one by one. One of the shipbreaking workers, his name was Angus MacDonald, said many years later, "When we started cutting the main armored deck, something happened right there. You understand, the armor there was so thick that the torch went slowly, very slowly. And while it went, there was time to think. Someone welded this steel, someone laid it, someone checked every seam, and we are cutting it. I felt uneasy. 3 months, and almost nothing remained of the ship. 3 months, against 7 years of construction. By November 1960, HMS Vanguard ceased to exist as a ship. Only memories remained, photographs. A few items managed to be removed before dismantling. Anchors, the ship's bell, plaques, personal effects of the crew. All this dispersed to museums, private collections, veteran families. One of Vanguard's anchors still stands in Portsmouth, just stands on the shore, huge, dark, silent, like a tombstone. I think about the people who stood on the banks of the Clyde on that August morning, about the old man who took off his hat first. What was he feeling? What was he burying? A ship? Or something more? A part of himself, a part of his world, a part of his country that would no longer exist. Sometimes saying goodbye to a thing is saying goodbye to an era. Sometimes the death of a ship is the death of an idea. And it is about this idea, the last chapter of our story. I want to take you back to that morning. Fog over the Clyde, cold water, thousands of people on the shore, an old man taking off his hat. We started with this scene, and the whole time I've been telling you this story, about the cursed turrets, about the shipyard under bombs, about the princess with a champagne bottle, about the royal tour, about the secret report. This scene remains somewhere at the end, as a final period. As an answer to the question we didn't formulate aloud, but felt from the very beginning. Why is this important? Why do we, people of the 21st century, living in a world of missiles and drones and aircraft carriers the size of floating cities, why do we need the story of a ship that hasn't existed for more than 60 years? I thought about this for a long time, and here is what I will tell you. HMS Vanguard wasn't just a ship. It was a question. A living, steel, deafening question that Britain asked itself and could not answer. The question sounded like this: who are we now? A great power builds the greatest battleship in its history, at the very moment the era of battleships is ending. This is not stupidity. This is not a bureaucrat's mistake. This is a very human thing, very understandable. We all do this. We all cling to images of ourselves that are already outdated, to professions that are fading, to relationships that have outlived themselves, to countries we used to be, instead of looking at the countries we are becoming. Vanguard was a mirror, and Britain didn't really like what it saw in it. Now, about what remains. Physically, not much. One of the anchors stands in Portsmouth on the embankment, just lying there. No plaque, no pedestal. Tourists walk past, not knowing whose it is. Vanguard's ship bell is kept in the Imperial War Museum in London. A few gun sights in private collections. Porcelain from the royal apartments. They say part went to auction, part stayed in the palace. And photographs. Lots of photographs. If you find them in archives, and they are available in the British National Archives, in the collections of the Imperial War Museum, stop. Look closely. Not at the ship, at the people next to it. Shipyard workers in 1941, tired, soot-stained, looking into the lens with a kind of special dignity. They are building something huge. They know it's important. They don't know the war will end sooner. The young princess in 1944, smiling, holding the bottle, her whole life ahead. She doesn't know she will be queen. She doesn't know she will outlive this ship. She is simply a young girl in the cold Scottish wind. The king in 1947, on deck, looking at the ocean, alone, tired. Doesn't know yet that he has 5 years left to live. And the people on the banks of the Clyde in 1960, taking off hats, crying, seeing it off. All these people lived their lives, did their work, loved, lost, hoped. And HMS Vanguard was part of their life, a big, steel, real part. That is why it is important. Not because battleships are beautiful, not because military history is interesting, but because behind every large historical object, behind every ship, plane, bridge, building, stand people. Living people with their stories, their fears, their hopes. And when we lose these objects, we lose a part of these stories, a part of these people. The dismantling of Vanguard was fast, too fast, as many said, as if they were in a hurry to remove the reminder, to forget, to move on. The New World didn't need old symbols. The New Britain, small, pragmatic, post-imperial, didn't want to look into that mirror. But here is what's strange. More than 60 years have passed, and we are still talking about it. Not about the ships that came after, not about missile cruisers, not about nuclear submarines, not about aircraft carriers with jet planes. About him, about the last night, about the ship that was late for its war. Why? I think because there is something universal in its story, something each of us has felt at least once in life. The feeling that you arrived at the wrong time, that the world changed while you were preparing, that everything you know how to do, everything you were created for, suddenly turns out to be unneeded. Not because of your fault, simply time. HMS Vanguard was late for the war, but maybe that is exactly what made it immortal. Ships that fought, they are remembered for victories and defeats, for specific battles, specific dates, specific casualty numbers. This is important memory, but cold. But Vanguard is remembered differently. It is remembered as a question, as a pause, as the moment when an entire civilization, a maritime civilization that built ships for 1,000 years, stopped, looked at itself, and quietly said, "That's it. There will be no more ships like this. Never." HMS Vanguard was the last battleship built in the world, by anyone, anywhere, ever. After it, not a single country laid down a single battleship. The era closed, not gradually, in one specific moment. The moment its keel was laid on the slipway in Clydebank in 1941. That was the last time in human history that someone built such a ship. Think about it. Humanity built battleships for 300 years. From wooden sailing ships of the 17th century, through the era of steam and ironclads, to the steel giants of the 20th century. 300 years of evolution. And it all ended here, at the shipyard in Clydebank, with this ship. It wasn't just the last British battleship. It was the final period in a 300-year history. After the period, emptiness. I thought about how to end this story. With what words? And I realized that the most accurate words had already been said. Not by me, not by historians, by one old worker standing on the bank of the Clyde in August 1960. The journalist asked him, "What do you think, looking at this?" He was silent for a long time, watched the departing silhouette, then said quietly, almost to himself, "I think there will never be another like this. And whether that is good or bad, I don't know. But like this, there will never be again. There will never be again." It was created for a war that ended without it. It served in a world that no longer needed its strength. It died young, at the peak of its power, in full combat readiness. And thousands of people came to say goodbye to it on the banks of a cold Scottish river. Maybe therein lies its main lesson. Sometimes greatness is not victory in battle. Sometimes greatness is dignity. The dignity with which you accept a world that has changed without you. The dignity with which you leave when the time has come. HMS Vanguard left with dignity, and we have not forgotten.